Hello. My voice is really amplified right now, so it's really exciting to have our friends here, Vital and Julie. I'll let them tell you about themselves because they have cool radio voices and I do not. So less of me, more of them. It was really interesting. A lot of people, when we said we're going to have this workshop, were asking me if we were pivoting to podcast only. Which will be really fun. I don't know how we put out a newspaper, just like all the transcripts. It's fine. It's all the same, but it's not. So what we wanted to do is sort of start these series of workshops to sort of give you a sense of different skills that are out there, things that we don't always have access to, but we're always trying to be like more experimental and focusing on digital. So the podcast idea is just meant to sort of inform you, give you access to cool people. If it's something that you're interested in, they have a lot of good advice. So we just kind of want it to be a fun sort of way to learn. So I will hand it off to you guys. If you want to tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Oh, are we? Sure.
Yeah, because those ones are.
Hi everyone, how are you? Friday afternoon, almost ready for the weekend. Well, I think we're actually going to start off by playing something. I'm Julie Shapiro. I'm the EP of Radiotopia. I want to quickly say.
And I'm Vital Mulvad, and I'm the EP of podcast at First Look Media.
So we both love to play audio for people, actually. And if we're going to be talking about a medium that you listen to, we really think we should start off with that. So this first one is sort of in the spirit of being fun, Friday afternoon, and in the spirit of what the H or F is a podcast anyway. We have a little treat for you. It's about 2.5 minutes. It's the first couple minutes of a podcast called The Organist. Anyone familiar? No, you will be after this. You're going to love it. Okay, so this is just answering the question, what is a podcast? Oh, my apologies. Talk for a second.
Okay. Just want to say we have a couple of topics that we were given by our colleagues to go through, but really encourage you to jump in and ask questions. We're happy to talk about anything.
Oh,
yeah. Do you need me to come more time?
Yeah, no, that's great. I just want to say the file was correct. The image that imported with it was not. Okay, here we go. Podcast, say it with me.
Podcast. Out of the billions of thermal tubes inside your computer, through some necessary wires and pipes, into your kitchens and living rooms and cars and office spaces and halfway houses. A veriform bouquet of content delivered with precision and love to you. It's magic. That's the only way to look at it. Magic, except it's not magic at all. A podcast is every bit as explainable as your toaster. As explainable as the crushing metals you feel in your chest whenever you think of your father. Never before has so little meant so much to so many. Podcast. Say it with me. Podcast. Please, I don't want to be the only one saying it. Can't you feel your lungs starting to burn with the truth of it? And yet there's still so much we can't know. We're just doing figure eights across the surface of it. How about some history? The podcast was invented as a way for people with computers to tell people with computers things through their computers. Some of these things are, hey, I'm over here, and I have certain feelings, and maybe if we thought about it this way. Through time, improvements have been made on the podcast until it feels ordinary and natural. But it's not natural. It's a frozen lake, iced over with enchantment. And like a frozen lake, this podcast is only here for a short time. And when it's gone, it's just back to being a lake with birds and reeds and shit. Where's the enchantment? Uh-oh, it's in you now. All you can do is spread it around. Hello, I'm Nick Offerman. You're listening to The Organist, the podcast of The Believer magazine and KCRW. Podcast. It gets better with time. It moves outward and upward with inchworm determination. It is here. It is inside you. It is about to begin.
So now you know. Anyway, I just love that. It demonstrates, great writing, great performance, a little silliness. And it really, this is a few years old, and I think it's hit on this kind of frantic. Everyone was sort of talking about podcasts and what are they, and still I feel like that frenzy is out there today, and there's so much interest. Here we are at a newspaper headquarters talking about what the potential might be for this form. So that's what we're going to get into today a little bit. Maybe I'll just say a little bit more about what I do. So I'm the executive producer of Radiotopia, which is a curated network of extraordinary cutting-edge podcasts. That's how we talk about it. I believe that as well. And we we don't do in-house production. Radiotopia supports producers in doing their best work, so we help them raise more money, grow their audiences, and sustain themselves, basically. We help with sponsorship sales, we help with tech support, we do a lot of promotion and marketing. And with our network, the producers are very supportive of each other. So we have cross promos, we get together once a year, they look out for each other, they go on tour together, we do some live events with them. So there's a real community feel to how Radiotopia came to be, and as it grows, we're trying to really keep all of that intact. On a day-to-day business, I send a lot of emails, I talk to producers all day long, I respond to people who want to make podcasts. I think about the industry, what's going on around us. I think about how Radiotopia fits into that industry, what else can we bring to it, how can we retain a sense of originality and uniqueness unto ourselves. And I've just recently, over the summer, been a little bit more involved with actual making of content, which we don't normally do, but we launched a show that we co-produced called Ear Hustle, which is produced out of San Quentin, the prison, and it's made stories told by inmates about life in prison. So I'm starting to get a little bit more involved with the content day to day, but generally what I do is wrangle, support the producers internally, and represent the network externally in situations like this one.
I too do a lot of wrangling. So I started my career in public radio at WNYC in New York, which is the flagship public radio station. For about 15 years, I worked with an arts and culture show called Studio 360, hosted by Kurt Anderson. And I think the reason I was able to stay with that show for so long is that we did all kinds of content, from what we call, two-way interview, just one person interviewing another person, to all the way to documentaries and performances and many things in between. So it was a great education. Because essentially, what are podcasts? It's radio, but it's just delivered in a different way. And I think there are certain things about the format, the fact that we are listening on our phones, that maybe has affected the way that we do content a little bit, but we can get into that later. So now I am the executive producer of podcasts at First Look Media, which is a startup that multi-platform media company that does film and digital video. We have a website called Topic.com, which has a lot of short films and videos and photography. And last year they decided to get into podcasts, and they found that it was a great way to kind of build an audience for a startup company. They launched Politically Reactive before I got there, which was two comedians doing a politics show, and then Missing Richard Simmons early this year was a really big hit. And then I also work with The Intercept, which is another part of our company, which is the news site, and launched a podcast for them in January called Intercepted. So I'm both helping The Intercept think about, which I think is translatable to you guys, being a written publication, thinking about what they want to do in the audio space, and I'm also on the more entertainment side, taking pitches for and developing more serialized doc-type podcasts like Simmons, and we're actually looking to get into the fiction space, which we haven't done yet. So, wearing many hats.
I'll just say, in contrast and with some overlap, most of Radiotopia was sort of founded as a network of storytelling podcasts. I also have a background in public radio. I helped co-found the Third Coast International Audio Festival in Chicago. It feels like a million years ago. And have a real love. Content for me has always come first, and so this position is actually very interesting because I end up talking a lot about not content, which is, I'm learning a lot, so I love that about it, but I do love to dig into the content and what makes things work and what helps them sing. Also, you sound great with ping pong in the background. It's great, I love it. The sound of ping pong. So I wonder what the best way to proceed. We can tell you a little bit more about what we do. We'd love to have your questions and get a sense for like what are your burning, you know, if it's like where do you actually start, it really depends on what you want to do. Like what is the content you all feel like you're experts on or passionate about and what can you do that's original and put out there that listeners don't have access to yet, or what can you do that's similar to something that's out there but different to how you would want to work with that content yourself. So clearly there's a lot of people in the room. I'm not sure if, you know, you probably represent all over the spectrum of the newspaper, but I think the first thing to identify always is like what are the stories that you want to tell and why those stories and why are you the person to tell those stories as a newspaper, as a reporter, as a department. So that would be first step, really understanding the content that speaks to you and that you want to convey to others. Any questions yet?
Go ahead.
When you're setting up a podcast or something like The Intercept, like what's the team you would put in place? What members go into actually producing a podcast?
Okay. So he's asking what makes a team. Who do we have on our team to launch a podcast? So, I mean, it can look a lot of different ways, but I think because this was an experiment for them, they didn't want to pour like a ton of resources into it. So I was told to try to put together a lean budget. We didn't have a studio there, so my first thing I had to do, but we decided that building something, not building, but putting together equipment in a room that was already there, it's more or less sound treated. It was used for video editing, so you know you need like a dead room, the opposite of this. You do not want to record a podcast in a room like this. Terrible. So got some basic equipment. We decided to work with the talent here. We need a room here, and then I decided I needed one lead producer in addition to the host. We knew it was going to be a talk show, not at this stage involve outside reporting because that requires way more resources. So I brought on one producer to start and then a mix engineer. I knew that the producer was both going to help book guests and edit down the interviews and be able to do a basic putting together or assembly of the episode, and then I hired a more professional sound engineer to mix, because my first step was to really get in conversations with the host and find out what was his, like to what Julie said, what stories did he want to tell, what it was his vision for the show. And Jeremy Scahill, who's the host, he had actually done radio before, working as a producer for Democracy Now! So he was very comfortable with the medium. So I guess you can do things with a very lean team, but this was a weekly show, and we wanted to be very reactive to the news. So recording things on Friday, not so much on Fridays, mostly Mondays and Tuesdays, and making it go out, finishing it Tuesday nights. So there are many Tuesday nights going into Wednesday morning, 4 a.m. So then we brought on a part-time production assistant to help us because I think you have to think about this also. If you're doing things online and you want to have article pages, you need to think about it's not just the audio production. How do you want to present this online? Do you want to, we also pay a transcriber. So they're just things that you have to think about. Would you need an image for the web page? Do you need all these little things that are besides just actually getting the show done around it that you also have to take into consideration? Now in our third season, we're looking to bring on a second producer, which I think will, because it ended up being a very ambitious show that is at least an hour long. I try to keep it to an hour, but others push it longer. And we generally have 3 segments per week, so it's a lot for one person to edit. But I think you can simplify. You can make a half-hour show. You could have one interview. You could certainly do a show with one producer. It just depends what's going into it.
You can have a lean team, but they have to exactly know what they're doing. So the technical skills are so important, and having the right equipment is so important. You don't want to make something that people aren't going to want to listen to because, the sound is bad and the P's are popped throughout. So you have to build a relationship with your listeners that is trusting, and they're going to trust you if it sounds like it's put together well. That's one reason they'll trust you. Of course, the information they get is the other reason, but you have to cover the basics. There's so much. I guess what I've come to realize is there's so much around making a show besides the actual content. There's hours of conversation about the content, but you also have to think about the logo. How is it going to look on a phone? Can people find it? Does the artwork convey the message of it? The marketing. How are you going to get the word out? How are you going to find your audience? How are they going to find you? all of the tech needs. I mean, being up on tracking your metrics so you know actually how it's performing, so you can adjust and respond to the, what listeners are saying. How are you going to engage with your listeners? Having a social media strategy is so important. I feel like the content goes out, and then the best, most successful shows really activate on social. It's such an intimate medium. People feel like they know the hosts, their best friends. They want to be able to reach out and they want to get a response back. So that's one thing we've really prioritized with Ear Hustle, the show I mentioned earlier, is very responsive, and people love it, and then they open up more, and you feel the impact because you're developing relationships one-on-one with a huge audience, but it can be very, very real for them. So just keeping in mind, these are the kinds of other things that are going to happen besides actually finding the stories, recording the podcast, editing it down, and getting it out. It's not easy. I would love to say, no, I wouldn't even love to. It just isn't. It's really hard. And sustainability when you're going into it is so important. You might have great ideas for 3 or 4 episodes, but what does your 10th, 11th, 12th episode look like? Thinking about a structure, can you do it seasonally so you're on for a while, then off? All of these things. I think the field is really experimenting now with format and seasons and structures and miniseries and things, so you don't have to just think it has to be a weekly. I mean, certainly you can speak to how challenging that is. It's also rewarding in a way that you build momentum in your audience. Once you start feeding people, they want more and more and more. And now I've even noticed, because we're experimenting with a show that has short series, and now everyone wants them all at once, because S-Town came, and now it's like there's a whole trend towards providing a lot of content at once so people can binge and be done with it and move on to the next thing to binge. So there's so many things happening. The other thing I think is so key is to be listening and understanding what's out there. What are you responding to personally? What are the things you want to stay away from? What are the things you want to, sort of emulate or contribute to a conversation happening in a certain way with a certain style? So, like, really understanding what speaks to you. You should do some testing get people sitting in a room talking about things and grow some thick skin and be prepared to hear feedback that you're not expecting, and then go back in. Iterations are really important when you're starting, I think, and trying lots of things. I would start with small projects and grow from there, scale up. Don't go for the, unless you're an experienced producer with hours and years and years of knowing how to do those things. If you're starting from scratch, I would start small and steady and strong, small and sharp, and then scale up from there.
So it's kind of like the follow-up.
Yeah, sure.
As like a follow-up to that, when it comes to more sort of the discussion-based kind of podcast as opposed to the true crime narrative one, I find that in just talking with a lot of newsrooms, there's sort of this misconception with people who might not have as much sort of broadcast experience that my column is really popular online when I write it. So if I just say, it's just an audio version of this, like that, people are going to be into that too. So like if you could sort of talk about the nuance, especially like the discussion based of what makes it sort of stand out. Yeah. Do you want to jump in first?
Go ahead.
Oh, I just think of the medium. Print does not translate to audio necessarily. Sometimes it does. It has so much to do with delivery and how it's, podcasts are often a conversation, and you've got to be able to nail that natural. When you're talking into a microphone, it's so hard to sound natural. No one likes what they sound like, but that assumption that it's one-to-one, it couldn't be further. With all due respect to these colleagues, I would never assume that. I'm not going to say never, but it's so. The point is it's sound and it's voice and it's emotion that's translated through voice and it's information. You can't put a bunch of statistics in a podcast and expect people to retain those numbers, where you could go back to print and double check or go back and read it again. So you have to really think about writing for audio is different than writing for print. They're completely different mediums. It doesn't mean the thrust of the columns wouldn't translate, but they would need to be considered as podcasts, not just.
Yes. Everything you said. Actually, I can relay a specific example. So I'm working with a columnist at The Intercept. I won't say his name yet because we're in our piloting phase. So like Julie said, it's really important to try things out. And so he wrote an intro for the show that we're trying out, and exactly that. He had a ton of statistics, and I was trying to be, and I did say to him before he was going to sit and record it, I said, there's too many numbers in there. The listener's not going to be able to absorb it. Why don't you pare it down? So he did I didn't go in there and edit it for him. I want him to learn. So then he did one, and then when he listened back to it, he said, "Oh God, that was entirely too dense. I didn't sound natural. Please let me do this again." So when you're doing it, you need to listen back to, and I think we're going to move towards trying to really get him off script. So we're going to go on a more bullet and have him, because he has experience in TV. Some TV announcing and presenting, and that's also not right. So even though there are similarities there too, there's a much more punch. It's kind of like the performance is up here for TV, and you want to get it, here and intimate for audio. So that's also a learning curve as well.
I'll just quickly say, you mentioned a very important verb, and that is editing.
Yes.
It was edited. It's so important to have editors on. I feel like that's what most podcasts are missing on the small teams. Someone else to listen and understand, like, oh, is this connecting for me? You know the story already. You're telling it in a way that assumes knowledge. Like I find that's something that I most often can give feedback on, is like, where are the missing gaps, because there isn't a connection made. So always having more ears on something before anything goes out is really important. Questions? Okay, we'll go this way across the room, maybe.
Is there I know with video, unless I got my stats wrong, but typically like the sweet spot for us, someone watching one of our videos, if it's longer than 3 minutes, they fall asleep or they stop watching. Yeah. Is there a similar sort of time limit on a podcast? Can it be, you mentioned an hour. Is there a sweet spot in terms of length of the podcast?
So this is a tough one, because I think it really depends. I mean, you can say, okay, let's go shorter because we're more likely to keep someone's attention. I feel like most podcasts either run in the just under 30 minutes or the hour-long shows. Then there are these outliers that are really popular. Like, I don't listen to the show, but the Joe Rogan Experience, that was called. It's 3 hours long, and people, I mean, his fans are rabid, and it's one of those top 10 podcasts in the U.S. So, I mean, so for every example, if I tell you, don't make it longer than 30 minutes, you're going to bore people. It really just depends. I wouldn't tell you to go and make a 3-hour podcast. I don't think that's a good place to start, but you certainly can keep people's attention for longer in audio than video, because for a few reasons. I mean, one, I think is the intimacy that'll keep on coming up, and it's this solitary experience, and you having it in your ears. That's what's kind of different about podcasting with radio. It's not so much about having something on in the background anymore. You're making a kind of a close interaction with it, and then the fact that you could also cook dinner while you're doing it or something, or fold your laundry. I think people can stay engaged for longer.
I love a shorter podcast. 3 minutes is too short, but in my opinion. But I love the 18 to 25 minute. I think, but I will say, before even talking about durations, it's really like, what does the content deserve? What does it need? And that's just different for every person in this room might have a different idea about what you want to do, and you're going to have a different ideal duration. I think it's true that you can listen on and on, but the other thing I'm facing, and I'm probably projecting because my job is to listen to all of our shows and everything else out there, is like, there's just so much out there. So if you think about, your listeners wanting to add your podcast to their huge slate of like their top 10 already, and you want yours to be regular, how can you squeeze it in? It's just like a space-time continuum issue. Like, there are only so many minutes in the day you can listen. So I have also been happily lost in hour-long stories. It just, with storytelling, especially if there's like really good structure, and it's told masterfully, I think those can easily go longer. But for me, the more informational ones and the more the conversational ones can go that long. They don't often have to. I've listened to almost every hour of The Intercepted, so like I can listen that long. But I think that a lot of them out there go too long, especially when you're starting. I would just like task yourself with not even going close to an hour on anything to start with, just so you start. You want to do more regular stuff, not fewer longer ones in the beginning. Do you guys want to listen to some more? We brought a few clips.
Yeah.
Just give you a sense of like what some stuff sounds like. We have a couple clips, not too much.
Do you want me to play? I can play
Yeah.
So, kind of on what we're talking about translating written word to audio. So I was going to play for you. Well, it's the other way. Okay, I'm going to play for you an opening to the show for Intercepted that Jeremy recorded, and it was pretty soon after the Las Vegas incident. And hold on, I need a second to switch this over. I think what this illustrates is just listen to how does it feel listening to this and thinking about that experience listening to it versus if you were just reading it on the page. Hold on, can you roll this? Now you kill time for me.
Anyone know what you're...
Julie, how long are the ear hustle segments?
Okay, those have run 24 to 30 minutes. Yeah, I think we had one in the 23s, but they're generally shooting 25 to 26. And I will say listeners always want longer and more, and we're sort of, we have very distinct constraints on that show, and yes, it's challenging and rewarding.
This is Intercepted. I'm Jeremy Scahill, coming to you from the offices of The Intercept in New York City, and this is episode 30 of Intercepted.
And what happened in Las Vegas is in many ways a miracle. The police department has done such an incredible job, and we'll be talking about gun laws as time goes by.
We live in a sick country. We live in a country where it is legal for someone to purchase 30 assault weapons and unlimited ammunition. We live in a country where it's legal to buy weapons that really only have one purpose: to hunt and kill other human beings. We live in a country where a cabal of high-powered lobbyists, bought-off politicians, and merchants of death profit off of the massacres of other human beings. We live in a country where the gun manufacturers love a mass shooting. And we live in a country where the Second Amendment of the Constitution has been laundered through lobbyists and some Supreme Court justices to mean something that it does not mean. The National Rifle Association, the NRA, whose leadership would be viewed as terrorist enablers and promoters in a sane society, they don't like the first part of the Second Amendment, so much so that they don't even include it on their very public memorializing of their holy Bible of gun addiction. At the NRA's headquarters, their version of the Second Amendment doesn't include the first half of the Second Amendment. The NRA really only wants you to focus on the second half, which says, quote, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." The first part of the Second Amendment, which the NRA finds very inconvenient to include on its headquarters, states, quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state." Was this Las Vegas shooter a member of a well-regulated militia? No. Were any of these murderers who shoot up schools or religious assemblies or workplaces, were they members of a well-regulated militia? No. And regulated, that's an interesting word, because no thoughtful person can really argue that guns in the United States are actually regulated.
So that's just part of it, but it goes on. Sorry. That goes on, but I mean, you can hear the emotion in his voice. It just shakes me up just listening to it. It was really raw. He was really, and I mean, we had such an amazing response to it. We actually got one handwritten letter where a listener said, you know, "Thank you so much for that powerful commentary. I played it for my husband, who's been a member of the NRA, and we always argued about it, and I never understood it. I played it for him, and at the end, after he listened to it, he said he was going to renounce his, revoke his membership." So, yeah, I think not only playing the clip at the top, but, you know, I mean, we have a news-based podcast where, you know, we're allowing our host to be very open and transparent about his point of view. So every episode does begin with a commentary, and that was a particularly powerful one, I thought.
I want to point out, though, something I love about what you guys do is some of the more creative approaches, too. So Jeremy has a fondness for audio fiction, and you know, so the show has over time developed these fictional segments as well, often at the top. And it's I have found like the Ear Hustle podcast is, not explicitly political, but has done more to make a case for something, which is humanizing the people who are incarcerated in the U.S. and everywhere. And listeners really respond. And maybe I'll just jump into my clip because this segue is, this was something that ended up in episode 3 called Looking Out, but it was also in a pilot that Ear Hustle made. They won a contest. Radiotopia ran a contest last year. Ear Hustle beat out 1,500 plus other entries to win. And so they got to be a show in Radiotopia. That was the prize. They weren't podcasters yet. They'd done some radio production. There's an outside volunteer, Nigel Poor, who goes into the prison and had been doing photography and some radio production for the local public radio station with the inmates. But she and two guys inside had this idea for a longer form storytelling, not constrained to a time clock, which of course is one big difference with podcasting. There's no time constraints, as we just discussed. Anyway, it was this clip in one of their pilots that made me realize the full potential for this topic, because it was devastating and yet highly entertaining and sweet and funny. It takes place at the end of an episode called Looking Out, which is about how one guy who loves animals managed to keep pets in prison. Tarantulas, mice, birds, spiders, and his relationship to animals. And it really evolved into an episode about looking after each other and nurturing. How do you nurture when you're actually living your life behind bars? But the producers on their own, they would go around into the yard. It's called Yard Talk. It's a segment that reoccurs, and they would just get different answers from lots of different guys. Because the show's hosted by Erlan, one of the inmates, and Nigel, the volunteer, and often they talk and feature one story, but then they'll break that up. This is also to point out, you can do a lot with structure. They break up the long stories with these segments where they go out and get more voices and more answers to questions. So this was in the podcast. It was in the pilot. They made 3 pilots. It was in one pilot, but it made it into the final version of the episode. And let me find it for you. Yeah, it's just a few minutes long, but oh, you're good. So this is, I think it sets it up pretty well. But
I know we're talking about deprivation, but there are 2 things that can never be taken away from you in prison, and that's your fantasies and your memories. So I've got a question for you. Since we've been talking about animals, I'm curious, if you could be an animal, what would you be?
Beluga whale.
What? Wow.
There's no rhyme or reason for it, but it just sounded cool. But we did go to the yard and ask some guys what type of animals would they be.
If I could be any animal, I'd be a penguin. They're super cute in tuxedos, and they're like the coolest animals ever. And they slapbox like crazy too.
I would want to be a panther, and the reason why is I like the sweetness of the animal.
Dog, because I know that someone would adopt me.
The Galapagos turtle, because they live to be over 150 years old.
Lion, because it's king. Marmot, because they're misunderstood. Everybody thinks they're weasels. And they're not. They're marmots.
I want to be a water buffalo because it's diligent and because it says very little.
It would be an eagle because they can fly. So that means I would always be free. I would always be safe.
Tiger, because tigers love their independence.
A jellyfish because it has no natural enemies.
I asked Roach what kind of animal he'd want to be, and his answer is pure roach.
I want to hear that. If I could be an animal, any animal, it would be a wish dragon that would only appear when the kid needed it, because my experience with imaginary friends, they were needed. So the thing about being a dragon is they eat meat, and I couldn't do that, so I'd have to be a vegetarian dragon, a thin vegetarian dragon, because I would spend a lot of time looking for food. That's a lot of carrots, that's a lot of apples, oranges, that's just a lot of vegetables. Who's gonna grow those vegetables for a giant dragon? Unless I'm a baby, that's a tiny dragon, then I just eat those slices of cheese. I didn't think about that.
So the last guy was who the episode mostly concentrated on. Anyway, I just love that imagination and play and these, it just revealed so much, but it could be worked into an episode that was about other very serious things. So, other questions or anything? Yeah.
Well, I just had a question about, because we're a newspaper company and like you're saying, start small. I think I wonder, just because you guys have seen metrics and clearly all markets are different, but do you have any sense how small can you go in terms of even niche? Like, because I was a big listener to Planet Money. I don't know if you guys know that one, but as I write in the business section, that was a lot of first-hand reporting, like a ton of work, right? So it's like if you're thinking starting small, things that we already know, things we've already done, conversational things, how small can you go and not have it be so small that two people would listen to it and it would just be gone?
I think if it's great content, you can keep it small to start. But you mean like numbers, or like what are your audience
because
getting?
It might be here with video too. You know, you don't need that much on video. People buy it up. It's great.
Right.
But where do podcasts fall in that? Like,
that's a good question.
US markets?
Well, partly one thing that we're always considering is sponsorship value. So I don't know exactly what your situation would be, but you know, you have to, in which case you have to have enough for sponsors to come on to. You have to have enough listeners, and you have to have enough content that, you know, so there's a balance there. But I don't know, like off the top of my head, if you started like a 8-minute weekly thing that was great content, I think that'd be a great start. 10 minutes.
And sort of the niche thing of knowledge we already have, like how would that look? You know, something that you don't have to go out and interview a bunch of CEOs and, you know, in the Planet Money stuff.
Right, yeah, that's like full-on production. Those are full
so
teams that work on it, yeah. I know the ambition and the scale just has to match what you can actually do, and if this is on the side of you're actually writing, but you know, it's challenging. I think the company would have to really give you guys some leeway and maybe invest a little bit in training and, you know, have someone come and listen to things at first, so you're really starting off on a strong foot. But and then I guess you have the ability to promote through the newspaper, so that's great. You can get readers on board, so you know, likely your numbers could start high. I think people would be curious to hear what you had to say, and then the content has to be, you know, sterling, so people come back for it and trust you and start to get to know you as a reporter. I think starting with what you know is fine, because your audience doesn't know that. You know it, and you also know what's like the most interesting and most important to talk about. So, yeah, I don't think you necessarily have to be learning with your listeners on the podcast.
Right, and does the sponsorship, do they tend to look for, you need 1,000 listeners and then sponsor, like how is
Yeah, I don't know if you guys have like a baseline. In the industry, I've heard 50K thrown around per in the US. Yeah, it's probably
yeah. We do that.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I mean,
But hey, that's like the tiniest fraction of podcasts out there have sponsorships at all. You know, like the smallest percentage have 50K or higher, if you think of all the podcasts. And lots of them manage to have sponsors anyway. So it's really, you can develop relationships. You can start locally. I always, you know, for young starting podcasts who are starting up, who are going after Casper and Squarespace. Squarespace is actually pretty generous. Like start local. One of my favorite examples is this great show from Nashville called Neighbors. And he now is working a little bit with his public radio station, but before that happened, he had like a local taqueria sponsoring in a brewery, and it was like, I'm never going to go to Nashville. Well, I might, but you know, I have no plans to go there. But I felt so kindly toward his sponsor, and it was probably a couple $100, not much, but it was something. And it, you know, sponsors beget sponsors, and it just was a way to do something in your local community as well. So you know, you probably have teams that would go after that, but yeah, it just depends a little bit on the resources you're starting with, I think. Anything to add?
Take another question?
Maybe also that question kind of relates to like deciding what is your podcast. Like when you're at a newspaper, maybe the temptation is to do like a news podcast where it's almost like a radio news show.
Yeah.
Or like a talk show, but do you find that it's better to categorize by like format or topic or, you know, like types of storytelling or go to like one place or?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's easier to try to figure out the heart of what it is you want to do, and then you figure out the format that's best for it, I think. I mean, with some restrictions as far as resources, but...
I mean, like with a market so saturated, like there's so many podcasts, how do you stand out? Do you stand out by saying, like, we're going to tell you Canadian news every day, or do you stand out by saying, we're going to tell you this, like, one tiny segment of the population, like, stories every week, or...
It's tough. I mean, I'm amazed at, now that I am working on a news podcast, I'm just amazed at how many more come out all the time. And I'm always watching the top charts in the American Apple podcasts. And I mean, it's it's amazing that there is still, people are always going to, especially right now, want to hear this stuff. Just when I think, like, oh, there's not going to be another politics talk show that's going to come and be on the top of the charts, it is. So even though it seems like everything has been exhausted, I don't think it has. But yeah, I mean, you want to have something unique, ideally, right? And then a lot of that can rely on the personalities behind the mic. Do you want to say something?
Like, I guess to further to that, like with the contest that you guys had, like the PodQuest.
Yeah.
Like when you had the PodQuest contest, there's so many submissions, or when you're trying to vet new ideas. Are there, I guess, like what we're really interested in is kind of how even that process works. Like, are there a couple really cool ideas, and then once you workshop it, like what kinds of things make you sort of say, oh, this couldn't happen?
Yeah.
Like, do you have a little bit of that kind of experience?
Yeah, well, PodQuest was a great experiment in this way. We learned so much about process by doing it. So we had 1,500 plus, got it down to 400, 200, 100. We brought some Radiotopia donors in when we got it down to 50, who had donated at a level where they had donated at a level that they could participate in our pilot fund. That's all they knew, because there was no idea what that would mean yet. And then one of my first things when I came on board, because I came on board with Radiotopia a year into it, they said, great, you get to figure out what the pilot fund is going to be. And then these donors are going to participate. And so so PodQuest came out of those ideas. But I say that because when we got down to 50, we invited the invested Radiotopia listeners to weigh in, and they gave us great feedback. And by and large, almost to the person, Ear Hustle was on their top 3 list. So that's when I started going, oh, it's what the listeners, out of these, great 50 ideas, this is what listeners are really drawn to. So we listened to that. They were in the top 50 because it was a great pitch. There was chemistry. There was, it was something we'd never heard before. Like, clearly there was nothing else out there like it, which was very important to us at the time because we got so many similar ideas, similar to themselves, similar to shows we already had in the network. You wouldn't have to worry about that as much here, but the point was it was so original, and the energy that they brought, and there was a lot of sound design, so for us that was important. It may not be for the podcasts you want to produce, but it stood out, and there was like a secret sauce to it, and we just could identify the talent there. Now we've had to really invest a lot of support in helping that talent become a podcast, but that's what really jumped out. And then when it got down to the 4 finalists, they each made 3 pilots. That's where I first heard that clip. And the pilots were uneven, so I think like when you're developing ideas, try a few different things, as I was saying. The show that won, Ear Hustle, had a continuity between the episodes. It really felt of a show, not just one-off ideas. And the other ones were great too, but they just didn't have that through line of like a very sense of what the show wanted to be. So like a sense of self as a podcast, that was very strong. I think it really depends, like it has to come, it's a combination of who's presenting, what is the content, what is the length, who are the listeners. I'm drawn to stories, so I think like starting with small stories about your listeners or about whatever beats you're on could be helpful. But if you have access to really smart people who listeners already know about and you can interview them, that's like a great way to get more attention too. Celebrities help, to be honest. Like, it just helps you get attention. I was at a panel, your panel, this morning. I love how Eric ended it. Because it was like, well, if you can get Beyonce on your show, but like you may as well, right? Of course, like it helps. And the social, plus you can start around things, but really makes a difference, I think, to be visible and audible out in the world. The hardest part is getting going. So probably what you should all do is just make something. Just start and help each other and like meet every Friday with beers and listen to your ideas. I mean, like really use each other and workshop. I always am telling people, partner up. It is a lonely go on your own, or clearly you have each other as colleagues, but I think like if you can really, figure out who has which skills and work it out as a little bit of a collective, that could be a really interesting approach. And a story unto itself, right? Like you want to get people interested in the story that you're making podcasts. Make a story out of the fact you're making a podcast and why you're doing it, and document that. There's a lot of creative ways you could start from the beginning and see what happens with it.
I just wanted to ask, are there any simple sort of tips for writing for audio?
Yeah.
We all have capacity experience writing for print,
Yeah.
which is different.
Yeah.
I know when I've tried to write some video scripts, I realize how complex my sentences are and stuff like that. And so I don't know if you had any quick sort of tips for writing for audio.
I can talk about that. Yeah. Yeah, I've had a lot of experience with that. I mean, I think what you just said is key. It's about not having sentences that are too complex. It doesn't mean your ideas aren't complex, but, and I think really the trick is to say it out loud. So write it, and if you're alone, I mean, that's why partnering up is good. If you're alone, you must read it out loud and hear yourself. It's better to read it for someone else and then edit it as you're saying it. And if you can't really riff off of notes and you want to read something, then you need to have the sentences be short enough so that you can look up off the page to finish the sentences. So that's another really good trick, that if you're not just reading it like this, if you look up as you're saying them. Another thing you could do with a partner is, let's say you wrote it and you're reading it and it's still sounding too dense or something, just have, your partner can then ask you, okay, wait, what are you trying to say? Just tell me right now, what is it you're trying to say? So then you'll say it like that and then you'll be, okay. So then if you need the notes, then you can write that down. But it's all about trying to sound the way you talk, right? So you just want to capture what you would say in conversation.
I'll just add one thing. We launched this Showcase podcast, which is these short series. They're very different one to the next. And we launched with a series called Ways of Hearing, which is about the shift, how the shift from analog to digital culture changes the way we listen and can perceive the world around us. Kind of cerebral stuff, kind of thinky, pretty essayistic. The guy who did it was a musician, Damon Krukowski, from a band called Galaxy 500. You may or may not be familiar, Damon and Naomi. And he had written a book on this. And so we were exactly doing this. We were trying to, he wasn't making a podcast version of the book, but we were making a podcast off the, with the material he had gathered from the book, but we were going to illustrate it through sound. So that was the first big difference. We were going to take all these concepts he was describing, latency and distance from the mic and intimacy and illustrate them as you're listening. And I think it did that very, very well. The hardest part was getting him to write for the podcast, not to rewrite the book. And the way I teased some beautiful moments out was by saying, how do you explain that notion in a story? Give me a tangible, give me a visual. He brought his mom into one of the episodes after a conversation that we had and talked to her on the phone to talk about what's lost on a cell phone versus old phones that you used, when you used to call up on landlines. And it was that is episode 3, it's called Love. I highly recommend it. It really worked and it was really charming and sweet. And it was a great lesson for me, the more he could personalize, you can't always personalize news, of course, but the more you can illustrate and give examples and not just, concepts are very hard one after another. In a podcast, it doesn't, they can be breathless. And I think the more scenes, audio can be very visual. I mean, it's like a joke we say, it's the most visual medium actually. But you're relying on attention and imagination on the listener's part, but the more you give them to draw in their heads, the more connected they are to the content, I think.
Yeah. I'd like to ask about the balance between telling a story and having a conversation with the audience. Do you rely a lot on the feedback you're getting?
Elaborate on that. What do you mean? What kind of feedback? On social media, or?
What's the balance between telling a story to the audience and having a conversation with the audience? Are the listeners an important part of the podcast? The feedback, and do you take a lot from the feedback you're getting?
You mean if they would be critical of something, would we change the direction, or do you mean incorporating their stories or something like that?
Making them a part of the conversation. So the communication is not only one way, but both
Yes.
ways.
I mean, I've done simple things on shows where using Facebook, we would ask listeners to contribute questions for guests. But I found that was never as fruitful as when you're asked. People love sharing their own stories. They like to talk about themselves. So if you can give them some kind of prompt and have them, I've done this with shows before. We did this on a special episode of Politically Reactive, which was a weekly show hosted by 2 comedians talking about trying to make sense of politics in America. And after Charlottesville happened, for that episode, we gave listeners a phone number to call in and leave their thoughts. And it was amazing how many people called who had actually been there. And so it was almost like we got some first-person reporting. You know, they were talking about it after the fact, but that was really moving to include. And then, so then you can kind of start this feedback where we were asking the listeners to leave voicemails, then they left voicemails that was in the show, then other listeners said, oh my goodness, I heard that, and they were tweeting at us and writing on Facebook, and so it starts to create this really nice back and forth, if that's what you mean. Of sort of, okay.
I guess I would just add, again, it goes back to, depends on what the podcast is about, because you know, a lot of ours are just storytelling podcasts. Not all of them actually anymore, but a lot of them are, you know, the producer's real vision, and they're like sort of presenting it as their art. So they're not, they'd love to hear feedback, but they're not necessarily primed or able to kind of incorporate that back into the show. But most of them get creative in lots of ways, and whether you run something on Twitter, you know, what do you think of that one? And we do sometimes Facebook Lives or AMAs on Reddit with the producers, so there can be some actual one-to-one response. Partly all of that is really hard to do on top of making your podcast. So this is, herein lies the balance of like making great content and then actually supporting the content in all these other ways that you want to do it. But it's fun and listeners love it, and you know, sometimes you get total gems of responses. And the Ear Hustle has been interesting. I've been blown away by response. Nigel and Erlan put out a call for postcards, and people have been asking us questions through postcards that then they answer on the show. And also, Nigel's a visual artist herself, a photographer, so she said, I wonder where you are all listening from, send us pictures of where you're listening. And then we just started hundreds of snapshots of people listening while they're cleaning other people's houses, garbage collectors, letter carriers, moms with newborns. Like, we started getting a real visual, and they were sharing them, so their other listeners were getting to also see who the Ear Hustle community's been. So that's been phenomenal. I feel like there's a layer of community between listeners at this point, as there is one with the show. So I think that all of that to say, the listeners are hungry for that, and if you really connect with them, they open up and they tell you their vulnerable stories, and they want to, you know, you want to thank them for sharing, but like they also start talking with each other, and that's another, it doesn't work for all shows, but it can work for some. Any questions? Yeah.
Like a lot of newspaper companies, our branding of ourselves now is we're more of an online company, like a media company. What's the elevator pitch to a company like us to say, and I guess if you have the Intercept, to add podcasting to the suite of things?
Why should you add podcasting?
Yeah, or more. It's more likely why. Like, if I want to do a podcast, how can I convince people who sign off on stuff like that that they should?
Oh, so okay, so not convincing your listener, convincing people here.
Yeah.
I think the way, you know, we won people over at the Intercept was that they saw that what we're talking about just now, this level of listener engagement, is not happening on the website. And they even have a Facebook page which with a gajillion followers, and people commenting, but it's not the same. It's not creating community. It's just people just firing off like, what's Glenn Greenwald saying again? Like, it's not people sharing stories or engagement really. So it created this whole other layer of engagement. It's deeper engagement. It's building loyalty. It's having your readers and audience getting to know your writers. It's having them invest more in the voices from your newspaper.
One thought is, how much do you know about the audience for the newspaper?
Me, I don't know.
Like demographics, like is there a general? What do you know?
Yeah, it's older men.
Yeah. There you go. There's your pitch. All right, podcast. You know, there's a bajillion studies out there now that say like medium ages. You know, 30s and 20s to 45. So you're going up. This is a way to attract new listeners. It's highly. I mean, the Radiotopia split is actually 55% women listeners. So you can balance up some gender stuff there. I'm generalizing, but you know, this is why all media companies are trying to podcast now, at least in my experience, including public radio institutions, the CBC, the ABC in Australia where I worked for a couple of years, NPR. They're all trying to steer these enormous ships in a new direction, understanding that the technology is different now. So for the radio broadcast medium, it's crucial, but for all of these other media organizations, I mean, the Daily from the New York Times is like, people are fetishistic about it. They love it. I'm one of those people. You know, it's a new way for me to consume news. So it's just, you know, I feel there's so much potential in growing the audience and serving the audience you have in another interesting and deep way. Yeah.
If, let's say I'm able to convince people with money it's a good idea, what's the one person I should tell them to hire? Like, what's the first thing you need to add to our team?
Can you give 2 or 3? It's hard.
How much
Yeah.
can you do? Like, do you need someone? Do you know audio?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
No.
Get a technical person. I mean, you have editors on staff, you have writers on staff, you have storytellers on staff, so you're actually ahead of lots of shops. But you definitely need the technical. You need to know what you need. You need someone to cut and mix and all those things. So yeah, you need an audio person. Luckily, there are so many employable independent audio producers out there, at least in the U.S. But it's a skill set now that's so valuable. Finally, we saw these young kids coming into radio for so long, and there were just a few jobs in public radio besides internships that were for free, and only certain segments of the population can go work for free, etc. Now those skills are so marketable. I mean, they're out there. Yeah.
What do you think of more of a frontline PBS, but in audio documentary style, like half an hour? Does that work at all?
Oh yeah, well Frontline just launched their podcast about a month ago, or relaunched. I think it had been going. Yeah, they're out there. They totally work, but that is hard. I mean, that is top level mastery of understanding how to audio storytelling in the audio format. So I wouldn't start there. But if you can grow, I think you have to actually put some audio producers on staff. Or have them pay for training, like have actual training, have people come in and do actual hands-on workshops with equipment, but then you need equipment. I mean, I don't mean to discourage you, but we want to set you up to do it right.
Just to piggyback on that, if docu-style is like the high level, what's kind of the training is?
There are a couple different things you could try, but I guess the most basic format, one would be one person speaking, which there are plenty of podcasts out there and some that are really popular. The second then would be interview. Another thing to try is the roundtable format, which, from Slate's Political Gabfest or Pod Save America or NPR's Politics or 538, where it's just people from, from the organization are just sitting around and talking about topics that it's not scripted. So when there's good chemistry and when it can be focused and when surprising things happen, it can be compelling, and it's pretty simple to make. It still needs direction, but it's relatively easy.
There's a show in Radiotopia called The West Wing Weekly, and it's basically a talk show about the West Wing. And it is like a very unusual, 2 years ago, Radiotopia probably didn't imagine having a talk show about a TV show in its roster. But the guys who make it, they go 45 minutes to an hour, and they talk to each other. One is a producer of another podcast in our network called Song Exploder, Rishikesh Hirway, and the other host was in the West Wing. He's an actor, Josh Molina. And so, it's got that going for it. They're both really funny and spontaneous. But the reason I bring it up, besides I think it's great, and I had never seen The West Wing at all, and we picked up the show, and I thought, now I have to listen to this really long podcast. It's weekly. So I started watching the show too, and now I love it, and I can't wait for the next episode to drop because they're going episode by episode. But my point is, the reason I love it is because it's not just a conversation between two people. They reference clips, and then you hear the clips. They invite relative politicians to come in and talk about things that happened in the show. Now, this is specific to their show, and they came to podcasting with a huge audience that wanted to hear the show anyway. But my point is, they get so creative every week. There's just a tiny bit extra production, and I think it brings so much to the fact that you're just listening to a conversation for an hour. Again, they have ready-made content, but they have a sense of humor about it, and they bring things in, and it just really lightens it up. And I think that you could do a pretty simple two-way interview, and you could add a little bit of tape here and there, and that all of a sudden you've got more than an interview, you've got a podcast.
I know your time is limited, but I guess to close off, unless we have to talk more, but I'm curious to know there are so many podcasts, and I'm wondering if you can reflect a bit on the trends right now and where they seem to be going, and your thoughts about that, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing.
there's a new trend happening now, which is kids podcasts. So that's a space to watch. I think a lot of bigger players are getting into that, and so it'll be interesting to see if those are successful. I'm very curious how long the true crime thing will last. I mean, it doesn't seem to be dying down at all. Dirty John just is at the top of the U.S. charts now. I don't know if it still is. Have you heard about it? Yeah. Yeah. So just when you think, but I think that's why all those crime procedural shows are popular till the end of time. There are certain things about those types of stories that most of us are pretty compelled to listen to, whether we like to admit it or not. What about you?
A trend that I'm really happy about is this notion that there has to be more diversity in podcasting. We're trying to do our part. I think we could do better, and we're hoping to change that in the next year. So I think there's a lot of stories of people of color and diverse cultures telling stories. Now, one thing I think about this is like these pitches come a lot, and they tend to be like, I'm a person from this culture. I want to talk about being a person from this culture. And that's one thing, I love those, but I also want to hear all of those people just making whatever podcast they're passionate about also. So, I think like there's a way to encourage all kinds of ideas to come out of all kinds of people, and I hope that's going to continue. But I do see it, I'm hopeful. I think the industry is embarrassed by itself and is trying to course correct a little bit. And, I take responsibility for some, I'm someone that can help that happen. I hope we can really make good on that. And then another trend is on a much shallower level is just short series. These are starting to come up more and more. Dirty John's a great example. We launched this showcase to feature smaller ideas that make great 4 or 5 episode shows, but don't need to go on and on. I think we're going to see a lot more of those. I think it's I think most of the networks will probably develop something like that. You see them launching on their own anyway, even if they're not in a network or in a larger podcast that features lots of them. So, and those are fine. It's just like there's a huge haul to get. The danger with that is it's a lot of work, and then it's kind of there, and then people are moving on to the next. So, if a vessel that presents lots of those is helpful. That's my experience so far with Showcase. But listeners tend to like one thing, and if you present very different things one after the next, we don't know yet how audience behavior will react to that. So I find those, that's another trend. What else?
Well, thank you.
Sure. Sure. Good luck. I hope we come back next year and get to hear all about your first podcast.
Yeah. Richard, feel free to reach out and get in touch.
Yeah. Sure. Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. You're welcome.